This is Vance again, and we're now ready for Unit 11 Notes, Part 3. Today we're talking about patterns in evolution. So there are a lot of different mechanisms involved in evolution. Big thing always to remember first and foremost is that evolution occurs in populations, and it is not in search of a particular goal. Okay, so we're going to talk about two major parts of evolution: the macroevolution. Macro means large-scale patterns and processes, and microevolution, which has to do with changes in genes and gene frequencies. Okay, so there's several different kinds of patterns that are involved in these large-scale processes over long periods of time. One is coevolution, where species change in response to changes in each other, species that live together and are adapted together. Convergent evolution is when you have unrelated species that have a tendency to resemble each other due to similar adaptations in environments. Adaptive radiation, which is when one species adapts to multiple forms over time to take advantage of different habitats that may be available to them. Catastrophism, which are extinctional level events that lead to opportunities for adaptations. And then we have the comparison of punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism, meaning that a punctuated equilibrium is large changes in relatively short periods of time followed by gradual changes over longer periods of time. So we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. So coevolution is when you've got a species that are closely associated with each other, and they influence the evolution of each other this way. There are lots of examples of insects, of flowers, and the specific pollinators that can pollinate them. The best example here, I think, is an orchid that was seen by Darwin back in the mid-1800s. We call it Darwin's orchid now, and it has a very long nectar tube down to where the nectar is, and in order to be pollinated, an insect has to reach all the way down into that tube to stimulate, to get the pollen from the from the anthers way down inside the tube. And Darwin said at the time, in order for that flower to be pollinated, it's going to have a moth with a very long proboscis. Well, years and years later, a moth was discovered pollinating that exact flower that has a very, very long proboscis that matches the length of the pollen of the nectar tube in the orchid. And so how would something like that evolve? Well, for instance, if you have a flower that has a pollen tube that can be easily pollinated, that means just about anything can pollinate it, but they might be able to get the nectar without pollinating it. And so there had to be special adaptations with it. And so over time, the pollen tube got longer and longer, and the moth's proboscis got longer and longer. Here's a actual picture of one of those moths getting nectar from that kind of flower to show. And so these two species changed in response to changes in each other, and that influenced their evolution over time. And there are countless examples. This is just a really good example to show in pictures. Convergent evolution is when you have unrelated organisms that evolve similar traits because they live in similar habitats. And the picture here from your textbook shows several really good examples. Big thing to remember is that all of the mammals that are native to Australia and New Zealand and Tasmania and around there are all marsupials, meaning they have a pouch, like a kangaroo does, like a possum does as well. Okay. But there are many species that are present in both Australia and the New World, and the Old World for that matter, that have similar characteristics. And so here we have a wolf, which is familiar to us in North America, also present in Europe and Asia. Okay, and here we have a Tasmanian wolf, and a Tasmanian wolf again is a marsupial, but it has similar adaptations and lives in a similar way to the wolves that we have here in North America. Here is a placental mouse, like a normal mouse that we have here, and a marsupial mouse. Very, very similar. They live in similar ways, and they look very similar to each other, but they're not related to each other. A flying phalanger is the Australian equivalent of a flying squirrel. And again, that's very similar traits, very, very similar, very, very different origins. And so that's convergent evolution. Another example would be like a shark and a whale, a shark and a dolphin. Okay, sharks and dolphins look very, very similar to each other. They live in similar ways, but dolphins are mammals and sharks are fish. Another example of these large-scale patterns is called adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is when an ancestral group of organisms diversifies into a variety of different forms that are specialized to fit different environments or ways of life. And this particular picture is showing some of the different species of finches that Darwin saw in the Galapagos Islands that were all apparently descended from some ancestral finches that got blown by a storm to these isolated islands, and then over time adapted in different ways because they had different capabilities to live in the different habitats that presented themselves there. And there are lots and lots of examples of those kinds of things as well. So Darwin's finches is a really good example of adaptive radiation. Catastrophism is when you have natural events that change the environmental conditions, and often that causes mass extinctions. Okay, so example, 65 million years ago, a meteorite hit near right off the coast of the Yucatan in the southern Gulf of Mexico. Changed pretty much everything. Wiped out the dinosaurs and made way for mammals to become the predominant land animals. Volcanic activity can also stimulate the evolution of new forms, and climate change definitely can have an effect on it. And so the big thing is to realize what effect that has. The species that survive, again, there are lots of habitats that are opened up that were previously not available to them. And so those animals that have adaptations that allow them to take advantage of that environment might evolve and change in different ways over time to take advantage of that. So a punctuated pattern, gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, this is sometimes one of the hardest things for students to understand. The big thing is that you might have a very long period of time with no change at all, and then all of a sudden something happens to cause change to occur. And so that would be, gradualism would be, you have long periods of time with very little changes over long periods of time, whereas a punctuated pattern would be if there was some kind of a catastrophic event perhaps or something like that, there was all of a sudden some kind of mutation that occurred that changed, that made a big change that then persisted in the environment, persisted in the population, and then over time stayed pretty much the same because it was relatively stable. It's basically, it doesn't have to happen one way or the other. Depending on circumstances, both of these things can happen at different times. Now, microevolution is changes in gene frequency over time. And when we talked about genes, remember we talked about polygenic traits and things that had variation within a population. And remember when we looked at the skin color graph, it made this normal distribution of a bell-shaped curve in the population, whereas the majority of individuals are at or near the average value, and there are very, very few that are, like for instance, if this was, medium skin color, there'd be very, very few compared to that are very, very light, and very few that are very, very dark. But then as you move closer to the average, there were more and more individuals that had were closer to the average value. So we're going to look at some examples of how that might change when conditions change in the environment. So there's something called directional selection. Directional selection is when that whole graph basically shifts one direction or the other due to changed conditions. For example, all short-necked giraffes died off because the food sources on the lower branches were eaten by other animals. So the giraffes that survived to reproduce were the ones that had longer necks and were able to reach up higher than other animals were and still get the nutrition they needed. So over time, the length of the neck in giraffes shifted, the average length of the neck in giraffes shifted to the right if you look at this graph, okay, because it was a bigger advantage to have a longer neck. Were there still some that had shorter necks? Absolutely. And they were probably the fewer and less successful than the ones that had longer necks. And so that would be an example of directional selection, when conditions change to make being at one end or the other of the spectrum a big disadvantage. And so that can cause the whole graph to shift over one direction or the other. Here are a couple of different populations of mice to kind of show you how this might work. Okay, so stabilizing selection is when it's a disadvantage to be at one extreme or the other, but a big advantage to be in the middle. And so in a stabilizing selection, most of your population is going to fall within a very short range of the average value, whatever that happens to be. Notice here at the beginning we had very light colored mice and very dark colored mice, and so here we have ones that are just kind of right in the middle. Directional selection, again, is when it becomes a big disadvantage to be at one end or the other, and the whole graph shifts over one direction. And so, for instance, if there is more dark rock available than light-colored rock available for the mice to forage on, then the lighter-colored ones on the dark rock would be at a disadvantage for being lighter-colored. And so, over time, the population, the average color of the mice would shift to this direction because it's a bigger advantage to be dark. And those would be the ones that would survive and be able to reproduce. Disruptive selection is kind of the opposite of stabilizing selection, in that when it's an advantage to be at one extreme or the other, but a disadvantage to be in the middle. And over time, that can lead to the development of two separate species if there's enough difference between one end and the other of the graph. Then it might eventually lead to these two not being able to interbreed at all in the future. Now, there are various things that can lead to some of these changes, okay? One thing is called genetic drift. Genetic drift is a change in the gene pool due to chance. Let's say the beads in this bottle represent the animals that lived in a particular area in a forest, okay? There's a forest fire, and randomly most of the individuals that were green and the ones that were orange were all killed, and most of the ones that survived were the dark gray ones. Okay, that's called a bottlenecking event. Something happened just by chance. It wasn't that being darker colored was an advantage or a disadvantage. They just got lucky, and they were the ones that survived. And so our surviving population has mostly the dark gray with a couple of green ones in there. And so in future generations, there are going to be a lot fewer of these other phenotypes and genotypes because those genes didn't get passed along as often as the other ones because of this particular strange bottlenecking event that didn't have anything to do with adaptations or fitness. It had more to do with luck or chance. There are various isolating mechanisms that can lead to changes in species and in fact can lead to the development of new species. And so we're going to talk about isolating mechanisms, some examples of isolating mechanisms, but let's talk a little bit on generalities to begin with. An isolating mechanism is when you have two populations of the same species that are no longer able to interbreed. And there are various reasons this can happen. The picture that it shows here is this yarrow plant that has populations that live in different areas on the west side and the east side of the Sierra Nevada mountains in the western United States. And they have some different characteristics based on where they live because those populations, because they're isolated in these various pockets at different elevations, and have different environments they live in, the amount of rainfall or snowfall, the amount of soil they have available, and so forth, have slightly different, even though they're the same species, they are unable to interbreed or cross-pollinate with each other because they're more or less isolated from each other. So let's look at some examples of isolating mechanisms. By definition, a species is a group whose members can interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring, meaning that the offspring can survive and they're able to reproduce. When you form a new species, that's called speciation, and we'll talk a little bit more about species coming up pretty soon. These are various isolating mechanisms that often lead to speciation, okay? And some examples are habitat isolation, temporal, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic. So we're going to look at each one of those one by one. Habitat isolation is when populations are separated into habitats that do not allow them really to come in contact with each other very often. You have the snakes here. So these snakes on the snakes on the left live in the water. The ones on the right live on the sand. And so if they are adapted for those particular areas, they're less likely to come in contact with each other, and therefore they would be difficult for them to interbreed when it was time for them to breed, because they wouldn't be in the same place at the right time. Temporal isolation is when you have groups that are active at different times of day or different seasons of the year. For instance, these two kinds of skunks here, very similar to each other. One seems to be active in the daytime, the other one seems to be active at nighttime. And because they are active at different times, they're not likely to come in contact with each other, and so breeding would not be something that would often occur between members of those two populations. Behavioral isolation is when individuals of different populations respond differently to behavioral activities, especially mating behavior. If these two birds that are shown here in the picture are called blue-footed boobies, and they are birds that live in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, they have a very elaborate dance that the male has to do to get the female to accept him as a mate. It also has to do with the coloration of their feet, because they are particularly attracted to certain shades of blue. And so if the male doesn't make exactly the right moves and doesn't have exactly the right coloration, then the female will not have anything to do with him, and therefore they would be isolated from each other in terms of breeding. Mechanical isolation has to do with whether they're physically prohibited from exchanging gametes with each other. These snails have shells that swirl in opposite directions, and because of that, the proximity of their genitals to each other makes it difficult, if not impossible, for them to exchange gametes. And so there's a physical barrier that prevents them from mating with each other, and therefore that's going to separate them into different populations. Gametic isolation has to do with the fact that the eggs of one species can't be fertilized by sperm from another. In this picture, you have two different groups of sea anemones, the blue ones and the red ones. And the way sea anemones reproduce is they just shed their gametes into the water. And if the egg cell happens to meet up with the sperm cell, then they can fertilize and become a new embryo for the sea anemone. Since these are maybe competing species of sea anemone, it would not be a good thing for the blue sea anemones if the red ones were able to, or sea urchins, rather than sea anemones. I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing. If the blue sea urchins were able to be fertilized by the red sea urchins, then that might do away with the blue population since they're a little bit smaller. And so these gametes are arranged so that they are incompatible with the sperm of another species, only by members of their same species, and so that would isolate them from each other as well. You're tired of hearing me talk, so I'm going to stop here. This is the last part of this particular set of notes.